All right, fellow humans, welcome to today's episode of Vancouver Island Speaks, featuring a panel of extraordinarily courageous women, whom I'll be introducing over the next few minutes. My name is Stuart Parker. I'll be your moderator. I'm the second most canceled person in the room, so that's my main achievement that has got me here today. So let me do a brief intro. I'll do a longer intro for each individual speaker when they speak. But on the panel right now, we have Meghan Murphy, the most canceled Canadian, and public intellectual, writer, broadcaster, etc. We have Linda Blade, Doctor of Kinesiology, prominent coach, etc. We have Mia Hughes, journalist and researcher for Civilization Works, crucial in the exposure of the WPATH files, etc. We have Magdalena Houston, survivor of the trans cult and practitioner of healing, wellness, and many good things. And finally, we have Bryony Dixon, former director of the Nanaimo Fringe Festival, single mom, excellent human. So we'll now begin with presentation by Meghan. Meghan has been started Feminist Current in 2012 as the one gender-critical feminist publication that has consistently existed in Canada. One of the key opponents of Bill C-16, the gender identity legislation under which we are now all suffering. One of the few people with the courage to stand up so early in the teens when many of us were not paying attention or sticking our heads in the sand. I was one of those people then, and we owe so much to the people who stood up first. And I just want to add, Meghan is of course not just an activist against the gender orthodoxy, but for the restoration of a free and democratic society here in Canada. Take it away.
Thanks, Stuart. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. In this day and age, it's both so much easier not to show up in person and yet more pivotal than ever to do so. I think we've all been tricked, or many of us in any case. There's some Luddites still holding out, but I think many of us have been tricked into pouring a lot of our time and energy into online engagement. And at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist so early on in my talk, or a Luddite, this has, I think, served those in power and damaged democracy a great deal. It's manufactured consent on a whole new level. So many Canadians treat top-down propaganda as dissent and actual dissent as a threat to the propaganda. Government entities and big tech really have us working for them, except of course, we're not getting paid, they are. Social media is designed to make us feel like we're engaging, connecting, creating, doing activism. We feel like we're dating when we're swiping through faces on apps. We feel like we're learning about news or current events when we're scrolling. We feel like we're connecting with friends when we like their posts or comment with an emoji. And we feel like we're doing activism when we post a black square on Instagram or some AI-generated all eyes on Rafa image in our stories. One wonders, though, why that black square, which some of you probably recall, probably most of you recall, was allowed and proliferated across social media, across the algorithm, and why, for example, hashtag trans women are men gets banned. The truth is that what's allowed and what's supported by the algorithm generally serves Meta or Tinder or the government's agenda. And it has been revealed, of course, over the past year that social media apps like Facebook and Twitter 1.0 in any case were taking instruction from governments in terms of what kind of content, discussion, debate, information, and news are permitted. We've been left with few online platforms that refuse to take marching orders from the government, and those platforms are being punished accordingly. Of course, hashtag activism was already a thing before COVID, but the lockdowns forced everybody online 24/7, and I think conned many of us into believing we were connecting and engaging when in reality we were sitting ducks. Big tech, taking direction from government entities again, could determine the parameters of any discussion, what information we could access, what was fact, and what was fiction. So we could be convinced, for example, that a majority of Canadians supported government positions and policies, whether or not that was true. We could be convinced that we're the only ones in Canada who are worried about gender identity ideology, and that everyone else is on board. Or that we're the only ones worrying about free speech or bodily autonomy in Canada. So long as we're prevented from connecting with other Canadians in real life, out in the world, we can be convinced of almost anything. We were told that the truckers were white supremacists and Nazis, and that the anti-gender movement is a terrorist movement. And so long as we didn't see with our own eyes and hear with our own ears what real people were doing, feeling, and saying, we became the perfect consumers of government corporate propaganda. And so this is why coming to these kinds of events matters so much. This is why connecting in person matters so much. We all need to keep touching grass, as it were, if we want to maintain grounding in reality, make our voices heard, refuse to be silenced and marginalized, and be truly engaged participants in democracy. I watched an old clip of George Carlin recently, who pointed out that the limits of the debate in this country, this is true of America and of Canada, are set before the debate even begins. And this will sound really familiar to anyone who was around in 2016 and 2017 when Bill C-16 was coming around. That was Canada's gender identity legislation, which was passed in 2017, of course. There was no amount of writing, of podcasting, of tweeting, of pitching, of contacting politicians or the media that I could do that would push the mainstream media or the government to include the views of women like me in the debate. The Liberal government and the CBC and the NDP and the unions, I should add, had determined the question was one of left versus right, kind versus bigoted, the open-minded progressive versus the rigid old conservative stuck in the past, and even the feminists versus the various phobes. And there was nothing that would budge them. When the media was finally forced to cover the fact that there were women and feminists fighting gender identity legislation, it was because we were being threatened and protested across the street from the CBC at the Vancouver Public Library, and even then, they wouldn't walk across the street to see what we had to say. They hosted a panel in the CBC before the talk to discuss whether or not I might engage in hate speech, and they didn't invite me to participate. That was the extent of their inquiry. The media did allow, I think, Jordan Peterson to have a platform in opposition because they were happy to frame him as a misogynist and a danger to all progressive aims and values. So that fit their narrative. It was less easy to paint me, for example, in that light at the time as a socialist and feminist. And so I and others who didn't fit their narrative were ignored and erased. George Carlin also pointed out that the people kept outside the parameters of permitted discussion were marginalized, made out to be subversive or kooks, which is partly true, but the interesting thing is that the government and the institutions caught on to this. So they took the thing that wasn't subversive at all and not marginalized at all, and they pretended that it was. And those of us who were genuinely trying to have conversations that didn't fit into the paradigm set out were painted not so much as subversive, but actually as the powerful oppressors. So we were the ones who were trying to do the silencing and the suppressing, which is a complete reversal of the truth. In 2023, the federal government provided $1.5 million in emergency funding to ensure Pride festivals across the country remain safe. And Marcy Yen, who is our Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth of Canada, explained that small but increasingly organized hate-fueled groups have started targeting places that are intended to be safe spaces. And she said that a constituent who remained anonymous told her that Pride that year was different, saying, "We've never seen this amount of rage, we've never seen this amount of hate directed towards us, it's terrifying." Marcy went on to say, "Our government will not stand by while hate and violence seek to reverse decades of progress." Which, I mean, I can't think of anything more ironic, because what she literally has done, and of course what the Liberal government literally has done, is not just stand by while hate and violence seek to reverse decades of progress, but rubber stamp that hate and violence and that reversal of decades of progress. She and the Liberal government stood by while women were threatened, fired, punched, predated on, abused, and assaulted, while their rights were being eroded, and they stood by and watched as kids were being mutilated and rendered sterile on account of being told by these oh-so-kind adults that they were born in the wrong body and needed experimental, costly, brutally painful surgeries that often end in pain and lifelong complications. So this is what Marcy Yen and the Liberal Party have stood by and watched and actively promoted, in fact. And meanwhile, Pride is under zero threat from anyone in Canada. And we, the independent women whose lives and livelihoods are threatened when we speak in public about the fact that women are female, have to find and fund our own security, because not only would the government never provide a penny to protect us, but they actively vilify us, presenting us as evil hate mongers, effectively sanctioning the threats and protests we receive. I often imagine what would happen if they applied their own attempts at cracking down on so-called hate speech to the trans activists they support and who say the most horrific things about, and to women who refuse to sit down and shut up. So the government, the media, and big tech colluded very successfully over the past 5 or so years to silence dissent, to make us feel alone, and to ensure the debate around various issues, particularly gender identity ideology, was framed in exactly the way they wanted. They made us afraid to speak, not only online, but to our friends and to our neighbors. And no matter what they tell you about valuing democracy, kindness, inclusivity, their actions demonstrate not only that they don't value those things at all, but they actually abhor those things. They don't want free speech, free thought, connection, community, or inclusivity. They want division, fear, and hate. And we can't fall for it. We need to fight not to fall into that trap, not to believe that we live in a black and white world, divided up on strict lines based on who we vote for or on political identities. So just because you're a feminist doesn't mean you can't sit beside someone who votes conservative, or that you have nothing in common with a Christian. I'm not evil or racist or misogynist because I choose to vote for Trump or Poilievre. I'm making a decision based on what I've seen happen over the last decade, and because I am deeply concerned about our rights and freedoms. We are not the people we vote for. We're choosing a representative who we think will best represent our interests and the best interests of our country. We're not choosing an identity or a friend or a god or a husband or a wife. I just don't want us to fall into that trap, and of course I think we all do from time to time, of vilifying whoever the media or your Facebook algorithm tells you to. We need to talk to people in person, look them in the eye, and treat them like human beings, not political categories. Don't allow yourself to be their tool. Choose community. Touch one another. Make eye contact. Breathe on each other. I think people are often left feeling like they're helpless. What they can do, what can they do in the face of such powerful institutions? And again, I think this is why showing up to these kinds of events is so important. It is one of the things that you can do to actually make a difference. I think it's one of the most powerful ways you can dissent against government tyranny. It's one of the most powerful ways you can fight their attempts to frame the debate, to keep dissent marginalized, vilified, and relegated as crazy or dangerous. To show up and show your face as a regular Canadian who isn't buying it. To refuse to be canceled and to let them silence us. To refuse their labels and their smears. We're not the far right, we're not phobes or bigots or the weirdos left behind as the rest of the world progresses. We're humans, I hope, seeking truth, reality, integrity, and a moral compass. And that can't be avoided if people come to these kinds of events and see each other's faces. It can be manufactured, though, if we all just stay online absorbing the algorithm or whatever the CBC is telling us. Thomas Jefferson, of course, famously wrote that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And we can't be complacent. We need to be vigilant, even and actually, especially when they tell us that we're paranoid or hysterical or irrational or crazy or conspiracy theorists. We have to be vigilant because tyranny is not going to come to us in Canada through overt means, I don't think. It's going to come to us while we scroll and swipe and heart emoji. And I know that it might sound hyperbolic to Canadians who've been told their whole lives that they live in the best place in the world, the most tolerant, the most peaceful, the most kind and accepting and safe, with the best healthcare system and the best education and a feminist government that cares about the environment and women's rights and democracy. It might sound hyperbolic to say tyranny because there's no literal boot on our neck. We're all politely consenting to this march towards a Canada where it's a crime to disagree with someone on the internet or to challenge government policy, where people lose their jobs or lose access to their bank accounts or end up charged as criminals because they insist on calling men he or on defending their constitutional rights. But that is where we're going. And it is called tyranny or totalitarianism, if you prefer something a little more delicate, when we don't get a say and when we must be subservient to the state or else. It's not democracy in any case. That story we've been told and that we tell ourselves about Canada has lulled far too many of us into a sense of, I'm probably going to be about twice as long as I said originally. I have an entire book in front of me. Sorry, I did lie to you about how long I was going to take.
Well, I don't really know what my job is.
Thank you, though. That story that we've been told and that we tell ourselves about Canada has lulled far too many of us into a sense of complacency, which, if we haven't yet observed or felt the repercussions of, we will soon. I've changed my mind about a lot over the past decade. I don't identify with political labels. I try not to deal in idealism, but in reality. I prefer truth over fantasy. I prefer freedom over feelings of safety or comfort. I think what's happened to too many Canadians is that they've done the opposite, and they've chosen the comfort of things, of convenience, of what's easy and avoids conflict or uncomfortable conversations, the illusion of safety that comes with, a well-paying job or a condo or a social circle or a new EV, maybe some kind of social or political status. I think that a lot of Canadians have chosen those things over the truth, over doing what's right, over defending our rights and freedoms, because that's risky. And I think that maybe because a lot of them think they don't have to. And yes, of course, we all want to be safe and comfortable. We have access to those privileges in the Western world, and we're lucky in so many ways to live in North America. But I think we forget how we got here and what we have to lose. We forget that our rights only exist so long as we fight for them, and that free speech will be ours, but only as long as we use it. I was slow to take up the fight for free speech, admittedly. I trusted in the goodness of Canada. I trusted the government. It never occurred to me that I wouldn't have any right at all. It never occurred to me that a point would come where I couldn't say whatever I wanted to say, until it did, of course. And I think part of that's because we don't learn about tyranny in school anymore. We don't learn about what happens under dictatorships. I didn't in any case. We don't learn about the value of free speech, how we got it, and how easily it can be lost. And I think that's also why we hear so many in Canada saying things like, I support free speech, except whatever it is I don't like, or whatever it is I think is hateful. But the whole point of free speech is that it includes speech you hate, or that you're offended by. Of course, the Prime Minister is going to allow speech that supports his policy positions or his aims or his ideology. We need free speech for the stuff that doesn't. The stuff that he and even you find dangerous or hateful or threatening to your aims and ideas. The fact that it's the left and so many feminists who are no longer fighting for free speech but fighting against it might be hard to accept, but it is the reality. And it also goes to show that who is the marginalized and who are the persecuted is not stagnant. And I think that some people like to cling to that marginalized status, but the truth is that in Canada, in any case, it is the queer activists and the self-identified progressives and the feminists, in many cases, who are smearing and silencing and fighting to persecute and prosecute those who don't subscribe to their political views and ideologies. What was once the left is no longer. And I think that in many ways what the right is has changed as well. The NDP may once have fought for the working class and for women's rights, but that's changed. And you can cling to the past, or you can fight for what needs to be fought for right now, regardless of how that fight is labeled by those who are counting on you to continue to buy their good guy charade and counting on you to fear those labels. I did a master's degree in women's studies, and I barely learned a thing about women's history. Never mind the history of the free world. I definitely didn't learn about free speech. So while on one hand, I'm not sure I can fully encapsulate the extent of my disappointment in so many feminists in the Western world who seem not only to believe that free speech should be free only to those they agree with, but that it's not under any threat at all, despite the silencing of women being on full display right in front of us. I also understand why. Because when we don't learn history, we don't know what to fear, so we learn the hard way, often when it's too late. And that's what's happening right now. And we need to wake up. The first wave feminists who fought for the vote weren't left or right. They weren't fighting for a political party. They were fighting whoever was in charge for equal rights for women, regardless of their politics. They were advocating to get the politicians and the masses and their family members and bosses on side. They were fighting for the right to participate in public life, to have a say, to have a voice. They were fighting for personhood. And actually, women were not declared persons under the law in Canada until 1929. Winning the vote and personhood is still the biggest achievement in terms of women's rights to date. And that fight lasted for a century. which is something that's usually glossed over in retellings, which give the impression that the suffragists struggled for a few years until their husbands caved in. But women in the West haven't fought longer or harder for anything since then. And at the time, people thought the suffragists were crazy. The idea of women voting seemed so radical that at the first ever women's rights convention in the US in 1848, the resolution affirming women's suffrage was the only one that wasn't adopted unanimously. Participants at that convention were concerned that the demand for the right to vote would defeat others they deemed more rational and make the whole movement look ridiculous. So for decades following, that was the impression. Women's suffrage continued to be viewed as too dangerous and too radical even to discuss. The first Canadian Women's Suffrage Society was founded in 1876, but the organizers were too afraid to publicly label themselves as suffragists, so they called themselves the Toronto Women's Literary Club. So, that's to say we're not the first to have been afraid and to have our speech suppressed, and we won't be the last. We're not the first to have to fight. And despite the first wave feminists being painted as a bunch of racist white ladies by the modern intersectionalists, many of those early feminists came to women's rights activism from anti-slavery movements where their speech was being suppressed because they were women. And it was seen as monstrous still for women to speak publicly. The amount of feminists who told me back in 2016 or 2017 when this was all coming down the pike that they couldn't possibly speak out about gender identity ideology because it would take away from their work in other areas, or because it would impact their political positions or their relationships on the left was endless. But what is the point of having women's rape crisis shelters if men are allowed in? And what's the point of having free daycare if your daughter grows up and can't say no to a man in her change room? And I don't even know how you have women's health if men's bodies count as women's bodies. What are we even talking about then? We're taking crumbs, or too many of us are in any case, taking crumbs while allowing the most important things to slip through our fingers. The cowardice of many will never cease to disappoint me, especially from the feminists who are only here because the first wave feminists literally took a beating. There's nothing any third wave feminist has suffered that is anywhere near comparable to the silencing, mockery, persecution, risk, and literal beatings imposed on the women who fought for the vote. In 1908, 250,000 women marched to Hyde Park, the location of the famous Speaker's Corner, and set up speakers at 20 different platforms to rally for women's vote. Women's Sunday was the largest political demonstration the park and country had ever seen, and the Women's Social and Political Union had been holding meetings there since 1906 until about 1913 when the police banned them from meeting in the park. The women refused to comply and continued to meet at the park and exercise their free speech. And some of you may recall that over a century later, on September 1st, I believe, 2017, women gathered again at Speaker's Corner in an attempt to hold a meeting discussing gender identity ideology and the impact on women's rights. They were swarmed by trans activists, some holding signs reading "Kill all TERFs" and "No debate." One woman named Maria McLaughlin was viciously assaulted by a man identifying as a woman. Women around the world have risked everything for their rights. Women are killed in other parts of the world for fighting for their rights. We can't decline to fight in Canada when we're told we must hand over our rights to men who insist their clothing preferences or their desire to be objectified like a woman makes them female and therefore deserving of the right to intrude on women's spaces. What do we think it means to fight for our rights? Is it meant to be comfortable? Does it only happen when it becomes convenient? Only so long as we can fight from the comfort of our couch, once we've retired, once we get a raise, once the correct political parties are on board. No, we fight now or we fight never. We take risks and we do it together. We show up in person and we say what we think. We don't hide and we refuse to back down. There is nothing in this world that is more important than the truth and our ability to speak it. There's nothing more important than our rights and freedoms in this society. And that means our right to gather in public and say what we think, our right to participate in the democratic process, our right to protect ourselves and our children from predators. There is no right to force the public to accommodate your delusion. There is no right to force others to lie. Your comfort and validation is not a right. My free speech is a right, and I have the right to vote people out who deny me my rights and who demand I lie under the threat of censorship and persecution, and that's exactly what I will be doing in the upcoming election. I will not vote for a party that says a man is a woman and that I'm a hateful bigot who should be silenced and jailed for correcting that lie. There is no political allegiance when it comes to the truth. We are not obligated to remain devotees to any party because we might be labeled in an unfair or unpleasant way. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your friends say about you. It doesn't matter if they call you far right or a Trumpist or a TERF or phobic or whatever smear they come up with to bully you into conformity. What is at stake here is bigger than your income, it's bigger than your reputation, it's bigger than your comfort. We are in a fight for humanity and for democracy and for reality, and we're about to lose. So you who have shown up and who are showing up, you who are showing your faces and making your voices heard and gathering in public, you are the ones who will make a difference. You who gather together and stand with your fellow humans and say no more. We are in charge here. We live in a democracy. We are not owned by the government or the media. We will be free, and anyone who tries to take that from us will be voted out of office, because you are not legislating against reality or the truth or our sanity. Men aren't women, and anyone who wants to say otherwise can go shout it on a corner while we all go about our lives. Thank you for coming. Thanks for sitting through my book. All right.
Well, it's my great pleasure to say a few more words before Linda Blade begins to speak. She is a former Canadian athletic champion of the 1980s, former president of Athletics Alberta, who has achieved major advances in protecting women's sports, in defending women's sports over the past decade, and co-author of Unsupporting How Trans Activism and Science Denial Are Destroying Sport. Linda, take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, my mic's working. Thank you for allowing me to speak here, Meghan. And it's an honor to appear on stage with you and with everybody here. The thing I find completely unexpected and shocking is that some 6 years, I came late to this party, or this whole idea, this movement, and even 6 years hence, you know, it's still happening. The gaslighting is still happening. It's just insane that I would have thought when I got into this fight that it would have long been resolved by 2024. And yet, in the area of women's sports, we saw this summer when they came to the male boxers punching women in the face. We saw the head president of the Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach, literally saying, well, we don't know what a woman is anymore. I mean, honestly, the man made such an incredible fool of himself. And then we got to the Paralympics, where a man who's been long time competitor in men's running, father of 2, husband of 1, he's racing other blind women, visually impaired women. He's barely visually impaired, so he's identifying into, I mean, he probably is legitimately got some blindness, but he didn't run with a running guide. I guess it's an option. And then he's actually, his name is Valentina Petrillo from Italy. He's actually running against women half his age who were too blind, some of them, to even know they were running against a male. They only found out after the race. And I want to just read a quote that he said. He said, and this is in the Hindu Times, I just picked out a number of articles. Of course, these guys take up all the oxygen in the room, only the stories are about them. People said lots of men would go to compete as women just so they could win. But that's not happened at all. It's just transphobia. And, you know, it's like this whole gaslighting of, well, as long as men don't intend to be, they're not doing it to be winning, they're doing it to have their identity affirmed. As if women's sports is the venue for social therapy, so they can just be there. You know, I mean, and so for him to pretend like it's not happening, you go to the website, shewon.org, they track how many women have been displaced by men in sports. So far, even according to that website, 717 women have been displaced by a male in their sport, many different sports now. Over 1,000 medals have been lost. 522 competitions have had to be conceded. And the number of sports that this has happened across now is up to 37 sports. So it just keeps growing and it just keeps happening. And it is shocking that the world is seeing it and yet they persist. So I guess my chalk is really, for me personally, how did it get started? How did it start? How's it going? And what do we do about it? Okay, very simple. So how it started with me was I was president of track and field in Alberta, Athletics Alberta. So it was just one sport in the province of Alberta, but I had to go to national meetings. And I was at a meeting in 2018 where we were told by Athletics Canada leadership that henceforth, because of Bill C-16, we were supposed to have allow, if a boy or a man came up to our competitions, we run the competitions, and they would have every right to say, I feel like a woman today, and compete against the women and the girls. And I sat at the boardroom table and I said, that doesn't make any sense. You know that it doesn't matter what records have been set, at what level. It can be at the local level, high school, provincial, national, international, Olympic level. All the record books show men and boys outperform women and girls because sex matters. And the thing that really, that moment in my life where I sat at a table I'm the president of Alberta, president of Saskatchewan, president of BC, all of the presidents from across the country were sitting at the table. And when I said, this is crazy, you guys know it's not right, their reaction is what caused me to turn into an activist. Because instead of saying, Linda, yeah, you know, we all know that, but somehow we just have to pretend because of the government, blah, blah, blah. Instead of saying that, they looked down at their hands and they wouldn't look me in the eye. There was cowardice all around the table. And I thought, good Lord, like, this is where we're at now? We are the leadership of the country, and you guys you're too cowardly to make a decision about fairness for women and girls. And I'm here sitting as a woman who's been an athlete, I've been a coach, I've been a program director, I've filled almost every role in sport, and I know, and I've even been sent by World Athletics into Iran and Muslim countries back in the 90s. I was the one they would send to Islamic countries to teach Muslim women how to coach the girls because it was a segregated society. I saw discrimination with my own eyes in these other countries, and I'm thinking, here it comes to Canada. And I said, not on my watch. And so I went to social media because I tried to bring it up in the room. They all say, like, you should be polite and not go public and not say public things. But then you bring it up in the room and nobody wants to look you in the eye or say anything. And the president at the time of Athletics Canada, I took him for dinner. I said, what are you afraid of? You're afraid that some man is going to sue you because he can't go into the women's competition? He looked at me and and I said, Bill, I know what you're doing here, but think about this. There are many more women and girls who could sue you for sex discrimination. Why aren't you afraid of that? And he said, girls wouldn't do that. So there was cowardice, there was so when I went to social media, I really honestly went to Twitter because I didn't know, nobody else was saying anything. And I thought, well, heck, I'm just going to say this publicly because the elephant's in the room, somebody needs to say it. And thank goodness, the groups out there, suddenly Fair Play for Women found me, other people found me, and Meghan had a podcast with me, and I had such a good reaction. Yeah, thank you. So I, wrote the book. Finally, this was my COVID project, Unsporting, How Transactivism and Science Denial Are Destroying Sport. I wrote it with Barbara Kay. And so then I've gone to lots of different rallies in the States, Washington, D.C. I was at the NCAA championships where Leah Thomas was beating all the women. I was out there at that protest. And Kelly J. Keane was there, and Beth Stelzer, and it was great. I mean, just amazing. And, I just basically followed and watched and read and tweeted and did everything I could, okay? But one of the things that has come to my sort of, how is it going now? That was how I got started. Now, how is it going? But one of the things that I started to realize was that we needed to generate the heat and the noise, and that's true. But there's a point in which the resolution to this issue requires what I would call the strategic rebuttal. Strategic. We have to start getting a little bit more strategic. And I would say at 3 levels. We have the international level, so there has to be some activism happening internationally, and women from 10 countries last year launched, or in 2023, last year, launched the International Consortium on Female Sport. Groups of women like Fair Play for Women and Icons in the States and Save Women's Sports Australasia, we're actually behind the scenes now. We're writing letters, because we have, like Rima Al-Salem has told us, we don't know that you're out there. They're not reading Twitter. These people in these top organizations, they need to hear and see your letters. So we are starting to really be active internationally. And then at the national level, of course, there's national level, and Canada is just ridiculous. How many of you remember Ben Johnson affair and how shameful it was? I mean, if you're old enough like me, you remember how awful it was. And of course, we had the Dubbin inquiry, $5 million at the time, which was a lot of money at the time in the early 90s, to, review how come Canada got shamed by how come this man was cheating and what should we do about it? And we were doing all the hand wringing. And then they came up by 2003. They had the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport and the special governing body to make sure no cheating is happening. And that was the governing body. When I sat at that boardroom table, that was the thing. Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, CCES, was the very entity telling us we had to put men in women's sports. So, the thing is, if a woman does some doping, so they're in charge of doping control. If a woman is tested for drugs in sport, she will be banned with one little droplet of testosterone found in her system, right? And she might even, if she even gets by with it, she might gain maybe like 4, 5, 6% advantage. But then they're endorsing a man self-identifying into the female sport that gives him a 15% advantage in running, 20% advantage in high jump or jumping events, 50% in powerlifting, weightlifting, and 162% advantage in boxing. And yet that's okay, but one woman getting a 4% advantage by taking drugs is somehow not okay and will ban her for life. Like it just so the double standard and misogyny is over the top. And so nationally, I've already spoken with Pierre Poilievre's people. the very first thing that happens if he wins the election, defund the CCES. Get him out of there. And we can't let the Conservatives forget it, because we have it in there. You know, I managed to go to the policy convention last year in Quebec City, and the plenary session, the grassroots members of the Conservative Party put it in their policy document. But we're going to have to keep putting their feet to the fire if they get into office, because that has to happen. And then finally, local and provincial levels. Okay, so international, national, local. And I would say, Tim, are you here? Tim Tillman? Yeah, there he goes. Beacon Hill, right? Victoria, Beacon Hill. Conservative Party of British Columbia. They have the Fairness in Women's Sports, Women and Girls Sports Act. When they win in October, and I predict they will win, that government, the first thing they're going to do is pro-sex-based rights legislation. So please vote. So it's called the Fairness in Women's and Girls Sports Act. And so vote Rustad, please. And so basically the other thing locally is face-to-face rebuttals. And some of you know that last week I had the debate with Morgane Ogre in Vancouver. Had a face-to-face at the table and mediated by Drea Humphrey, and it was quite an interesting experience for me. And there just was no, it was hard. It was like I've said to people, it's really hard to debate this issue face-to-face because the shifting sands and the shifting arguments and there's no data. They present no data. I feel like it's like trying to paint a line in a river. It's just, you're trying to make a point, and then it just shifts. And the only thing you could always say is, you just have to be kind. You just have to be kind. And be nice, be kind. But seriously, dude, like, men were punching people in the face at the Olympic Games. You think it's kind for a man to punch a woman in the face? It's not kind. And you have never, the people who were behind Bill C-16 and all of these policies that they put in place, never one time consulted with women and girls for what we wanted. It's always what they want. And I said, I told him to his face, we want to place a seat at the table when it comes to these kinds of negotiations, because our preferences, our identities, and as real women matter. And we need to have a say in what happens to the laws about us, right? So all I can tell you is I think everybody knows. Now, everybody is talking about it. 6 years ago when this started, when I started speaking out, kind of nobody wanted to say anything. Now it's out there. It was a top story at the Olympic Games. Everybody's talking. I have a lot of hope that the tide is turning. It's just taking a lot longer than we thought, right? So let's just persevere, keep going, and thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Next up is Mia Hughes, Ottawa-based journalist and researcher for Michael Schellenberger's Civilization Works, author of the WPATH Files, such a crucially important investigative report. Take it away.
Thank you, everyone. So this is the first time that I've ever been invited to speak at an event in Canada. So I thought I'd start with the story of how I come to be here. It begins one night at a party in England, shortly after I graduated from university, when I made the reckless, spur-of-the-moment decision to move to Taiwan with a friend. Such behavior was typical of the version of me who existed at that time, but I certainly wouldn't have called myself fearless, because in the 3 weeks that elapsed before I boarded that first plane to Taiwan, I was terrified that I'd made an enormous mistake. But swallowing that fear, I packed my suitcase and I jetted off to live on the other side of the world. And it turned out to be the single best decision I've ever made, because I was about to meet the love of my life. One night, just months after arriving, I was standing outside a restaurant when a giant cockroach flew in, landed on me, and proceeded to run all over me. You're all thinking, this is the beginning of every great love story. So, as the cockroach was busy, leaving a traumatic scar on my soul, out of nowhere appeared a Canadian man who swiftly knocked the vile beast off me in one confident swoop and saved my life. Little did I know that at the time that this knight in shining armor was destined to become my future husband and the father of my 3 beautiful children. So fast forward a decade and many exciting adventures with countless highs and lows. And we were now a family of 3. We have a tiny baby. And I packed yet more bags and boarded another flight. And this time the destination was Canada. The year was 2010, and unbeknownst to me, and probably the rest of the population, the nation of Canada was poised on a precipice, about to tumble through the looking glass into the bizarre, inverted reality of Genderland. A pivotal moment in this rapid descent into chaos occurred 2 years after I arrived, with the passing of Toby's Law in Ontario in 2012. Now, sure, there had been rumblings for years as trans activists maneuvered behind the scenes, but Toby's Law, which added gender identity and gender expression to the Human Rights Code, marked a dramatic turning point. The bill was tabled by evangelical minister and NDP MPP Sherry DeNovo, who named it after her friend Toby Dancer, a man with a tragic story. In 1989, while living in Alberta, Toby had been stabbed multiple times by 2 homeless people, but miraculously survived the attack. Shortly after, he moved to Vancouver, began identifying as a woman, and then plummeted into heroin and morphine addiction. He then moved to Toronto and met Sherry DeNovo, and then died of an overdose in 2004 at age 51. DeNovo then took it upon herself to honor her friend's memory by enshrining the dangerous, pseudoscientific, entirely fictional concept of gender identity into law. And in her book published in 2021, she said something very interesting about the passing of the legislation. She said, "The rights won by Toby's Law represented a major victory. The law impacted the way our entire province did business, everything from identity cards to prison practice. I don't believe for an instant that the government realized the scope of that one change to the Human Rights Code. I'm glad they didn't look too closely." And that sums up all the meteoric gains of the early trans rights movement. Governments, policymakers, the general public, pretty much no one knew what they were supporting, and almost nobody understood the devastating impact it was going to have, precisely because no one looked too closely at what trans activists were demanding. This was, of course, possible because early trans activism was done by stealth, with trans activists concealing their mad goals, deliberately avoiding public scrutiny, and achieving the complete obliteration of reality before anyone even realized what was happening. But here's the thing. Why didn't people look more closely? Why did people throw their support behind something blatantly absurd and illogical? Why did Canadians en masse one day accept that men could be women, children could be born in the wrong body, and that it is ethical medical care to chop healthy body parts off teenagers? And why, perhaps more importantly, do so many continue to look the other way, even though the harm is now plain for all to see? Now, I know the answer, you probably know the answer, and Sherry DeNovo knew the answer too, because she said so in her book when explaining how she eventually got conservative and liberal backing for the bill. She said, "Those on the government benches were afraid to see the NDP march with Toby's Law signs in the upcoming Pride Parade. They were finally sensitive to any perception of transphobia." That is what props up this entire movement, the fear of being labeled transphobic. Gay rights were still fresh in everyone's minds, and there were clear good guys and bad guys, those who had supported the rights of gays and lesbians to marry the person they loved had firmly staked their place on the right side of history. So when another rainbow-hued rights movement launched, good, progressive, well-meaning Canadians immediately knew which side to take. And if they were unsure, trans activists made it abundantly clear by viciously attacking anyone who dared disagree. This wanting to atone for the sins of the past and fear of being caught on the wrong side of history is common when societies get swept up in mass delusions. And all too often, the good intentions lead to catastrophic damage. In the 1980s and 1990s, North Americans believed that a person could endure years of the most horrific child sex abuse and yet have no memory of it whatsoever until they found themselves in the clinics of recovered memory therapists. Even more absurd was the belief that this abuse could cause the personality to fracture so that one person could have multiple personalities, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, living autonomous lives in one body. There was no science to it, nor any truth, but large swathes of the population believed it to be real. The reason? Because until the child protection movement of the 1970s, child abuse went largely ignored. People refused to believe it was happening, or if it was considered to be a private family matter, and the victims were rarely listened to. The devastating multiple personality disorder epidemic and its even more insane sibling, the satanic panic, were in part a result of this pendulum swing from not believing any accusations of child abuse to believing all accusations of child abuse, no matter how implausible they were. People believed absurdities because of the collective guilt they experienced that so many children had suffered for so long in the shadows. As a consequence, hundreds of thousands of women had their lives ruined, and an equal number of families were destroyed. Not believing was also dangerous. Child protection activists and MPD enthusiasts accused dissenters of not caring about child sex abuse, or worse, of being one of the abusers. And so here we are in 2024, living through another such moment, but this one is even crazier. In a bid to right the wrongs of a homophobic history and desperate to separate themselves from the homophobes of the past, decent Canadians, in what is surely the darkest of all ironies, support a rights movement that persecutes homosexuals for being same-sex attracted and demands the medical conversion of gay and lesbian adolescents in gender clinics. Jostling for a place on the right side of history, Canadians looked the other way while rapists, pedophiles, and even a necrophiliac were moved into women's prisons. Rape survivors were re-traumatized by the presence of men in their shelters. The doors of female-only changing rooms were thrown open to every exhibitionist and voyeur in the land. and female athletes had their dreams shattered by cheating men. Afraid of being called transphobic, our mainstream media continues in 2024 to ignore the truth about pediatric gender medicine, not even daring to ask themselves the most basic question of all: who's got this wrong? Is it the Europeans, with their years and years of intense scrutiny, thorough investigation, and multiple systematic reviews? Or is it the ideologues inside WPATH who bury evidence that doesn't suit them, think eunuch is a valid gender identity, and surgically create second sets of genitals for severely mentally ill people? But nevertheless, there are encouraging signs that the spell is breaking. Provincial governments are taking a stand to protect our most vulnerable youth, with Alberta, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick leading the way. And out in the real world, Canadians are waking up. I talk to people from all walks of life about this issue because, as a wise woman on Twitter once said, the first rule of Turf Club is always talk about Turf Club. And in all my conversations with Uber drivers, at the hair salon, at the bar, wherever I am, no one disagrees with me.
That's right.
No decent person in Canada supports surgeons amputating the healthy breasts of 16-year-old lesbians. No decent person supports sterilizing mentally distressed adolescents. No decent person thinks it's a good idea to give exhibitionists and voyeurs full, unfettered access to the spaces of women and girls. No decent person believes women in the prison system should be locked up with pedophiles, rapists, or necrophiliacs. Every sane person in Canada thinks surgeons creating second sets of genitals for deeply mentally disturbed people is a ghoulish horror show. So, our ruling politicians may still be prancing around wearing menstrual bracelets while pretending they don't know what a woman is, cozying up to men who want women so vilified they don't dare speak, and festooning themselves in rainbows while marching in support of the worst medical crime in history, but ordinary Canadians have well and truly had enough. So this might not be the Canada that I immigrated to all those years ago, but there are plenty of reasons to feel optimistic that one day in the not-too-distant future, Canadians will emerge from the spell cast upon them by trans activists. The fear of being called transphobic is rapidly dissipating. In fact, if being transphobic means caring about women and protecting young people from medical abuse, I say be a proud transphobe. Mass delusions always end, and the truth always wins. We still have a long way to go, and we certainly have our work cut out for us. But courage is contagious, and because of people like you and events like this, a wave of courage is sweeping across the nation, meaning there is hope for Canada yet. Thank you.
All right, next up, Magdalena Houston, survivor of the trans movement, working in holistic healing and wellness, writer, chef, and truth teller. Please go ahead.
Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight and holding space for myself and everyone else to speak. Before I begin, I just want to preface that the language I choose to use in this piece reflect my experiences. Some choice words I no longer agree with or use anymore. I want to start by acknowledging how much it took for me to be here tonight. What began as excitement to share my story has slowly transformed into a deep vulnerability that I'm sitting with. Since I began speaking out about my views and concerns around the gender agenda, including surgeries to remove healthy tissue and organs, the use of hormones and blockers, and pronouns, I've been met with an overwhelming amount of hate. It hasn't just been hate, though. I've been harassed, bullied, and even threatened. Choosing to stand up and speak my truth is one of the most vulnerable things I've ever done. Yet despite the pushback, I know how important this story is, not just for me, but for others who may be grappling with similar feelings and experiences. I am, however, ready to leave the past behind and fully step into a new chapter of my life. One filled with immense love, compassion, and the shedding of any labels that have clung to me along the way. With that in mind, I want to share a small piece of my journey. 1,844 sunsets have graced the skies since I last cradled the weight of my breasts upon my chest. Deeply woven into my scars lies a chapter I will never forget. I've learned to deeply honor the sacredness of womanhood. What I once rejected, I now hold with reverence, and I vow never again to take for granted the vessel my soul resides in. This realization has pulled me toward a mission greater than myself, a deep calling to help others heal, to guide them towards their truths. For regret, I've learned, is one of the deepest pains one can endure. At age 9, I was confronted with experiences that stripped away my innocence. By the time I reached high school, I was facing relentless bullying, and I experienced multiple cases of sexual abuse with different men. These early experiences left a profound impact on how I viewed myself, my body, and the world around me. At 21, I shaved my head and began dressing in oversized clothes, hoping to hide my body I had been uncomfortable in for as long as I could remember. At the time, I was convinced I was a lesbian. Men were not just out of the picture, they represented something I deeply resented, something I didn't want to understand or engage with. My feelings towards them were potent and in many ways alarming. When I entered the queer community, I was welcomed with open arms. I found friends, and for the first time, I felt a sense of belonging. Many of my friends identified as trans, non-binary, or both, and I began to immerse myself in that world. My roommate at the time also identified as non-binary and had their breasts removed. There was definitely influence there, both subtle and direct. But much of that period is a blur now, lost in the fog of trauma. Trauma does strange things to the mind. It can distort your memories, twist them, and leave you with fragments that don't always fit together. When I moved to Vancouver, I began to talk more openly about my discomfort in my body. It was there I was introduced to terms like non-binary, which I had never heard before. I also started to learn about pronouns, and with every new piece of information, I felt like I was discovering a part of myself that I hadn't known existed. Leaving my home on Vancouver Island felt like an escape, a chance to run away from the pain, the trauma, and the identity I had known. I decided to change my name from Mag, that's what I went by, to Zabi, embracing the idea that I must be non-binary, and I began using they/them pronouns. For a time, I felt like everything clicked. I believed I had found the missing piece to my puzzle, the answer to why I'd always felt so out of place. I even ordered my first binder with so much excitement, as though this would finally make finally make sense of everything. Each step I took toward this new identity was met with celebration and affirmation. Every time I shared a piece of this new me with the world, people applauded. I was affirmed by friends, by strangers, by the internet, and in some cases by people who may have had doubts but felt obligated to show support. But those who had known me the longest, the ones who knew the depth of my trauma and lack of identity, they remained more reserved, likely seeing things I was not yet ready to confront. At age 23, I walked into Three Bridges Clinic in Vancouver. I remember speaking to a nurse or a medical assistant and telling her I didn't feel like a woman and I wanted my breasts removed. I was so nervous they wouldn't believe me. Looking back, it's clear now that I didn't fully believe it myself. The power of self-gaslighting is profound, and I had convinced myself that this was the right path for me. The nurse asked a few basic questions before explaining the next steps, waiting for approval, selecting a surgeon, and scheduling a date. She casually asked if I wanted to start testosterone, and I declined. I didn't want to look like a man, I just wanted my breasts gone. She also mentioned that I could choose to keep or remove my nipples. And then she brought up that I wouldn't be able to breastfeed. I nonchalantly responded, "Oh, I don't ever want to be pregnant." What she didn't know, what I didn't tell her, was that I had been pregnant once, at 18, and I lost the baby in the midst of an abusive relationship. 2 weeks later, I received a call. I had been approved for surgery. Within a year, my surgery date was set, and as the months passed, my life began to shift in ways I couldn't fully grasp at the time. My mother, in her gentle way, expressed her concerns, torn between supporting me and worrying about the path that I was on. I hold no resentment toward her. She did the best that she could with the limited understanding we both had. A close friend and roommate at the time also voiced their concerns, sending me a heartfelt email about my mental state, but I wasn't ready to listen. My father even wrote me a long letter filled with concern. I didn't speak to him for over a year after that. I refused to see the cracks forming in the foundation of my decisions. On the day of my surgery, my mother was by my side. She cared for me in the weeks that followed, helping me with everything from bathing to changing my drains. I couldn't have done it without her, but after that week, I was on my own. I remember the day I went to get my bandages changed. They told me I could remove them when I got home, gently wash my chest, and leave the wounds uncovered from there on. When I looked in the mirror, I froze. My nipples were blackened with dry blood. My right side was swollen and bruised. The sight made me nauseous, and I nearly fainted. I had to sit down, but even then, I convinced myself I had made the right decision. The power of self-gaslighting is profound. From that moment, I began to unravel, though it would take me 2 years to admit it out loud. During those 2 years, I worked in the adult entertainment industry, almost as soon as I was able to remove the surgery chest binder. I kept myself busy, distracting myself from the regret that had gnawed at me, but eventually I couldn't outrun it anymore. I left the industry, I left my home, and found myself increasingly isolated, not by choice, but because I was dismissed and abandoned by those I once called friends. As I began to voice my concerns around trans activism and the harms I was witnessing, I was met with silence, rejection, and judgment from people who had once embraced me. It was a time of severing, but also of rebirth. I returned to my mother's home, reconnected with my family, and began the process of reclaiming my womanhood. This journey of healing, mind, body, and soul, has been the most profound work of my life. Today, I'm in a deep, loving relationship with a man who has shown me what it means to truly be seen. I never thought I'd experience this kind of love after everything that I've been through, but I've come to realize that, like everyone, I am deserving of sacred love because I am sacred. I want to be clear. I am not ashamed of my past. Every person and experience has been a lesson and a teacher. I take full responsibility for my life and the decisions that I've made, but I also hold the medical system accountable. If they truly cared, maybe I would have received the help I needed instead of being handed the path of removing my healthy breasts. I am whole, I am not broken, I am not ruined. I found my way back. I hope my story inspires other women like myself to come back home to themselves, to nurture and nourish all parts of who they are. You deserve to live a full, happy life, intact in mind and body. I would give anything to have my breasts back, but I've learned to care for the parts of myself that remain. Take care of that precious mind so you can take care of your whole self. Trauma is deeply woven into the lives of so many young women like myself, but the way back to ourselves does not involve harming our bodies. If you want to fall in love with healing yourself, you must first fall out of love with harming yourself. There is an immense depth to the pain, confusion, and even joy that has shaped my journey. While this is only a small piece of the larger story, I hope it resonates with those who find themselves in a similar space of searching, of questioning, and of trying to make sense of their own past. Healing isn't linear, but I've learned that coming home to yourself is the most sacred journey of all. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. Bryony Dixon, you got a tough act to follow. British-born single mom, canceled from her role as artistic producer of the Nanaimo Fringe Festival for her views on gender, remains an activist for free expression, and has a new role with the Civilization Works crew. So this is just excellent. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Are we good? Okay, great. During my last talk, I alluded to the marketing of transgender ideology leading to the sterilization of gay, autistic, and indigenous kids as being a cunningly revamped and rebranded 20th century eugenics program. Today, I'd like to explore that analysis further because I think it's time we confront why and how the world is being gaslit over this issue so badly. At the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg Code, Holocaust survivor Vera Sharav spoke of the gradual perversion of medicine by Nazi eugenicists, who first controlled reproduction through forced sterilization and then euthanized thousands of worthless eaters in a precursor to the Holocaust. She said something that stuck with me.
They utilized modern technology, low-cost industrial methods, an efficient transportation system, and a highly trained bureaucracy that coordinated the industrial genocidal process.
A highly trained bureaucracy. Ever since hearing this, whenever I found myself in an inclusion workshop, following some tedious dissection of the gender unicorn, I noticed just one of the ways ideological blinders are erected around our mass consciousness. These re-education programs that I'm sure many of us here tonight have been subject to are really an exercise in soft power. The same power evoked by Yin Zhu Zhen's imposing Beijing central radio and television towers that I saw once at the Tate Modern. The textile medium represented the CCP's exertion of control through economic and cultural means instead of hard military force, which got me thinking about how my work as a theatre producer crafted elitist narratives on behalf of various levels of Canadian government, who are apparently owned by this guy.
We penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau. I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
Transgender ideology is not a homegrown phenomenon. Canada is at the forefront of a global cultural, political, and industrial revolution. But Plato's timeless allegory of the cave is still as relevant as ever, with humanity shackled, forced to stare at shadows cast against the cave wall by hidden puppeteers. It was recently suggested that given current polarization, there are actually two cave walls with two different projections. On the larger wall, with Hollywood-level production value, they perform a dangerous grievance narrative, stoking fears of a growing populism with alleged genocidal underpinnings, with every shadow assuming the shape of a far-right bogeyman. But others in the cave are shown a completely different reality.
8-year-old transgender lesbian. I dare you to try and stop me from going into a women's bathroom. This is a call to action. You need to arm up.
They see rapists in women's prisons, and they see families ripped apart.
So she was 19 when they decided to take her life away because she was not happy. None of the stuff that they allow her to do worked. Because I want everybody to know that the system is taking our children away.
Anyone who escapes to the outside world soon realizes the agitprop within the cave serves an external agenda. But returning to the cave to emancipate the other captives is met with distrust and rejection by those who prefer their blissful ignorance. In the West, public grants for Plato's puppeteers are contingent on various global initiatives devised by the World Economic Forum's collective of corporate, government, and civil society stakeholders. Once seemingly admirable terms have become Orwellian doublespeak for cultural imperialism, systemic inequality, and the often violent exclusion of other worldviews. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges described woke imperialism as devoid of class consciousness and another tool in the arsenal of the imperial state, allowing liberals moral superiority as they castigate, censor, and deplatform those who do not linguistically conform to politically correct speech. Hedges asserts they seek to make the ruling class more palatable, and with the support of the Democratic Party, the liberal media, academia, and social media platforms in Silicon Valley demonize the victims of the corporate coup d'etat and deindustrialization. This managerial class shares what Rob Henderson describes as luxury beliefs, and heretics challenging their utopian orthodoxy must be silenced. In June, I hosted, or helped to host, the first ever Westminster Free Speech Forum, convening free speech advocates from across the world to tackle the censorship industrial complex. Founder of the Foundation for Freedom Online, Mike Benz, created this quadrant representing a whole of society censorship framework playing out across the globe. Throughout my career, I found myself mostly situated here, having worked within both arts and culture and higher education bureaucracies, which are heavily dependent and therefore totally beholden to the demands of the government. Benz's example pertains to the US, but Canadian censorship, which follows the same playbook, was detailed by Stephen Moore at the same conference. He outlined legislative underpinnings of censorship here, key players, and the various NGOs that push government propaganda and popularize censorship. Another speaker at the conference identified a well-rehearsed pattern. First, a perceived threat is announced, say, for instance, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service warning that the anti-gender movement poses a threat of extreme violence. Then, state-funded NGOs produce dubious statistics to suggest that the perceived threat is on the rise. Governments respond with vague plans to counter the threat, but given there is no treaty definition of hate speech or misinformation, hard law remains very difficult to adopt. So instead, regulations and agreements are quickly adopted and enforced by the private sector. In addition to the Twitter files revelations, last month, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg confirmed that the White House pressured Meta to illegally censor true information. And here's Wikipedia's co-founder speaking of clandestine influence operations.
Between 2005 and 2015, it was on their radar. Wikipedia moved on to the establishment's radar. And of course, we do have evidence that the CIA and the FBI computers were used to edit Wikipedia. And you think they stopped doing that back then?
Of course, gender-critical circles felt the hand of big tech censorship long ago. It resulted in Meghan being banned from Twitter for 4 years, was it? 4 years?
Yep, 4 years.
4 years. Advertiser boycotts are another censorship mechanism. A collective responsible for roughly 90% of global advertising spend established the Global Alliance for Responsible Media to dictate which content would not receive advertising support by its members, which included sensitive social issues like the one we're discussing tonight. But why? In the US, over 500 pediatric clinics have sprung up in the last 16 years. Given this increasingly lucrative market, any content highlighting the damage of transgender ideology must be demonetized, de-amplified by algorithms, and smeared by the corporate press. After all, Big Pharma spends $18 billion a year in advertising in the US alone. Surely, Mussolini's famous assessment of fascism as a merger of state and corporate power could not be more applicable than it is in the Western world today. Ironically, most self-proclaimed anti-fascist trans rights activists share in Mussolini's insistence that we do not argue with those who disagree with us, we destroy them. But the fight for free speech has not been easy. Each time the information landscape is further democratized, elite panic and crackdowns on free speech have come to be expected, like the Catholic Church's response to the invention of the printing press. Widespread access to the internet has been no different. At the same time we're told to destroy the patriarchy, we are subject to incessant infantilization. Just look at Police Scotland's recent hate monster campaign, publicising a new law criminalising speech even within the context of a theatrical performance. Brave Scottish TERFs and comedians immediately satirise the hate monster because humour is the best antidote to tyranny.
For me, comedy isn't about laughter. It's about reinforcing progressive social values.
Some here may be familiar with an earlier progressive era in the US, characterized by opposition to individualism and classical liberalism, and the aim to replace the waste of capitalism with the efficiency of experts and social engineers. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? At the same time, the American eugenics movement was gaining momentum thanks to major corporate backing.
Eugenics was exported from the United States to Nazi Germany. It never was abandoned. It just got its name changed. So population control, there's the Population Council. There are all kinds of institutions that essentially continue to push the eugenics agenda.
But surely the progressive mindset of the ruling class has shifted since then. Well, compulsory sterilization is an ongoing practice in Canada. And in 2009, American billionaires were hosted by Bill Gates at a meeting to consider how their wealth could be used to curb population. Gates's foundation was once called
of the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population Control,
which we've just heard is a euphemism for eugenics. But Gates is certainly not alone in this mindset.
First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
When we invest in clean energy and electric vehicles and reduce population, more of our children can breathe clean air and drink clean water.
What do you see as the biggest challenges in conservation?
The growing human population.
And do you have views about what should be done about that?
Can't you guess?
There will be a need to kill many billions of people or to starve them to death or to prevent them from giving birth in order to reduce the population of this world.
Now we see the creation of a new massive class of useless people, that computers will outperform us in most tasks and will make humans redundant. And then the big political and economic question of the 21st century will be, what do we need humans for? Or at least, what do we need so many humans for?
Now, I might not jump to such sinister conclusions if I hadn't just witnessed the emergence of inconvenient truths surrounding COVID or the criminal upward transfer of wealth during that time. Maybe if I hadn't seen the glamorization of euthanasia in Canada or the 30% jump in maid deaths year over year, so that it's now the 5th leading cause of death here. But I see disturbing parallels between earlier eugenics programs, MAID, and the current push to chemically castrate a generation of Indigenous so-called two-spirit kids and others who might have once been deemed mentally undesirable. I almost wasn't surprised to see Canadian politicians brazenly honor a Nazi. In his novel, That Hideous Strength, C.S. Lewis called it, "Why, you fool, when did you meet a workman who believes the papers? He takes it for granted that they're all propaganda and skips the leading articles. He buys his paper for the football results. He is our problem. We have to recondition him. But the educated public, the people who read the highbrow weeklies, don't need reconditioning. They're all right already. They'll believe anything." Today, they'll believe safer snorting kits should be given out to school children, in spite of 45,000 opioid deaths in Canada between 2016 and 2023. Largely thanks to another hugely influential philanthropic dynasty, the Sacklers, whose painkiller OxyContin bore the marketing campaign to start with and to stay with. And who could forget the Forever Wars? But BlackRock's CEO, who oversees $10 trillion in global assets, sees perks to declining populations.
And the social problems that one will have in substituting humans for machines is going to be far easier in those countries that have declining populations.
And Policy Horizons Canada describes how biological and digital systems are converging and could change the way we work, live, and even evolve as a species. But must premeditated feticide really be part of our evolution?
The first trans woman to have a successful uterus transplant, ovaries and eggs included. And I want to be the first trans woman to have an abortion.
Although a biological caste system isn't any more appealing.
Another possibility is the division of humankind into different biological castes, with the rich being upgraded into virtual gods and the poor being degraded to this level of useless people.
Our life in 10 years from now will be completely different, very much affected, and who masters those technologies in some way will be the master of the world.
But now let's imagine a scenario in which elites could profit intellectually and financially from their depopulation agenda by marketing transhumanist identities to our most impressionable. Classroom to clinic pipelines seem to be an integral part of the fourth industrial revolution. And billionaire autogynephile Jennifer Pritzker is heavily invested. In 2016, the UVic Chair of Transgender Studies, funded by Pritzker, hosted a keynote speaker, Martine Rothblatt, a transhumanist biopharmaceutical industry CEO, entrepreneur, and lawyer who sees transgender ideology as the on-ramp to tech transhumanism.
There are also some kind of ultimate stages of technological transhumanism, which are not really in existence today, but society is rapidly moving in this direction.
He goes on to describe downloading your mind from the cloud, dispensing with your body entirely, and assuming any desired form with the use of nanodrone technology. And as if this wasn't unbelievable enough, Rothblatt is also number 42 in the 2024 Forbes list of self-made women. Along with Pritzker and Rothblatt, we've now seen emails from Biden's Assistant Secretary for Health, Admiral Rachel Levine, discussing revenue models, profit projections, and the return on investment derived from transing kids. Court documents revealed that Dr. Levine pressured WPATH to remove age restrictions for gender-affirming surgery in their Standards of Care 8. And yet here he is, admitting he's glad he didn't transition as a minor because of the whole castration thing.
No regrets, because if I transitioned when I was young, and I wouldn't have my children. I can't imagine a life without my children.
So we appear to have a corporatist, technocratic elite openly advocating for depopulation, combined with rich and powerful autogynephilic men playing God with their transhumanist experimentations on our kids. Societal acceptance of such atrocities can only be achieved through censorship and propaganda, of which cancel culture is another component. It works by intimidation.
If you see a turf, punch him in the fucking face!
It works by harassment.
Shut your stupid fucking mouth, you stupid fucking turd! Shut your stupid fucking mouth, you stupid fucking turd!
It works by deplatforming. Even a 21-year run of the Vagina Monologues, a fundraiser for a domestic violence shelter, was abruptly ended for being hurtful, harmful, and exclusionary. While just over the Salish Sea, we've got drag camps for kids funded by all levels of Canadian government. Canada's anti-hate network outlines cancellation tactics in 40 ways to fight the far right, which labels women's rights organizations as far-right hate movements, and describes deplatforming as a fundamental principle of anti-fascism. They even provide venues with directions to deny bookings to bad actors like us ladies up here. Meanwhile, any real semblance of a free press has long been hollowed out, with once trusted outlets now in bed with governments, advertisers, and the mega rich. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gave $250 million to global news media in the first half of 2020 alone. Big Pharma constitutes 75% of total TV ad spending in the US, and CBC's $1.4 billion budget is well known at this point. Ideologically conformist portrayal guidelines now exist for major world events like the Olympics, insisting phrases like biologically female are avoided by journalists. So is it any wonder that our media landscape looks like this?
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarmingly, some media outlets publish things they simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their
This is fucking scary.
Yeah.
This is the scariest.
Well, that's propaganda.
On the digital front, Google has talked about using big data to sequence human behavior and re-engineer humanity since at least 2016. According to the former Army intelligence officer Jacob Siegel, that's what these people are trying to do. They're trying to control and define the contours of reality. But Veronica May observes, when information borders no longer coincide with state borders, it becomes increasingly difficult for propagandists to make falsehoods believable and truths evadable. And every now and then, our subconscious betrays our programming.
I know you guys are objective over there, that you just report the news as it is. Oh, I know. CNN makes a... I know.
Is that supposed to be a lav line?
But what with our Western leaders so intent on undermining national and individual sovereignty, replacing it with one world governance, our chances to escape Plato's cave will become fewer and farther between. I used to wonder how the theatre would survive the arrival of cinema, then streaming and virtual reality. But the uncovering of the censorship industrial complex made me realize that live events are the last holdout from our would-be censors. We must protect all channels of free expression so that an organic countercultural resistance to global totalitarianism can flourish. A pluralistic, pro-human culture that promotes agency over victimhood, curiosity over grievance, and one that champions truth over diabolical ideologies. Thank you.
So a few quick housekeeping matters before we go to phase 2 of the evening. We have first of all, Cara McMinn has a table set up back there. She's doing a cross-Canada bicycling tour to tell people about the harms of gender orthodoxy in form of individual conversations. We've got a good collection of, we've got books, and we have half an hour now to entertain questions and comments from the floor. We kind of prefer the questions, but This is the Vancouver Island Speaks event, so speak, Vancouver Island. Who would like to have their turn at the mic? All right, come on up.
Hi, I'm Scott. I'm one of the council. And my question is for Coach Linda Blade.
Yes, sir.
How confident are you that the incoming Conservative government may finally reveal the gender-based analysis plus on Bill C-16, or do you think they will at all?
Okay. What Scott is asking me about is that when Justin Trudeau came into office, the Liberal government promised that any new legislation would be accompanied by what they call the gender-based analysis, GBA, where they would consult with people involved in any bill and women, or based on gender. I don't know what he means by that because he doesn't recognize sex-based rights. But anyway, they went ahead with Bill C-16 without having done a gender-based analysis. As I said, they did not consult. And even when they had somebody like Meghan Murphy at the table, they did not even listen to what she was saying. And so then around 2000 and I think 19 or 20, Jennifer Ann in Toronto went on a campaign writing letters, and a lot of women joined her, to ask the government to release the GBA. Where is the analysis you did that said this was okay with Canadians? And they kept, hesitating and putting it off and trying to ignore the women. They kept getting more and more letters. And they finally released the GBA, and 98% of it was complete redaction. All of the document is just darkened out. And they said, I think it's cabinet privilege. They claimed cabinet privilege. And so this is what Scott's asking me. If there's Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives finally win an election, will they release it? I have a strong suspicion they will, because they're going to point out that I think what's going to happen is it really wasn't done at all, but I don't know. I think they were in a hurry to pass the legislation and do everything according to their ideological masters and didn't bother. And they're just pretending like they did, and they don't want to say what it is. So I think, once again, and I've been told this by Lorraine Harper, who is wife of former President or Prime Minister Stephen Harper, that I've been reminded that it's not good enough just to have the next government come into power and think they're just automatically going to do these things. Because the Prime Minister is a busy guy, and he's got a ton of things to do, and every government will have many, many things on their agenda. When it's a good step if the Conservative Party of Canada wins, but that's only a step, because it means that all of us are going to go back and have to write letters again saying, release the GBA, tell us what was in that document, release, repeal Bill C-16 or amend it somehow for sex-based rights. There's going to be a lot of advocacy that has to keep happening when they're in power, because they just won't get to it, just because of the sheer volume of things they've got to fix. And we know by now they've got to fix a lot of things. So my encouragement for everybody is that when the time comes, just keep advocating that we will never let this go. We want to see what happened.
Please come up.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Hal from born and raised in Victoria, now from the Comox Valley. Can't touch the mic. So it really seems like momentum is increasing against the baloney, and just what came to mind is a question what we're all looking, many of us are looking for are ideas for Achilles heels. September 20th is coming up. There's action across the country, and I've got my own thing going on in the Comox Valley, but just if anyone has any brilliant concepts of what they see as being Achilles heels or weak spots on the ideology. Thanks.
So that's open to the whole panel. What are pick a vulnerability? What do you see as the major vulnerabilities of our current of this hegemony?
They're not fun. They're really miserable, and that's why I was trying to get across, like, if we can get some comedians pushing back, push that Overton window culturally, I think that would help. But it's a longer term game.
Well, I mean, you do point out an important aspect of this, right? TV is getting terrible. Entertainment is getting terrible. Authoritarians are just very bad at entertaining us. It's just not their thing. You can be good at authoritarianism, or you can be, good at stand-up. I don't think there's any overlap. Maybe Stalin, but I don't think even there. Any other thoughts on current weaknesses, vulnerabilities?
Probably won't surprise you. For me, the Achilles heel is the adolescent sex change, so-called adolescent gender medicine scandal, because we were all once teenagers. And so if you can really, all you need to do, I think, is get people to understand what they are doing to teenagers. And then people are horrified, because everyone remembers how impulsive they were, how sure of things they were when they were teenagers, and looking back, how utterly ludicrous most of those beliefs now seem. And so I find it never fails. When I talk to people, I always, of course, talk about the adolescent medical scandal, and it never fails as long as you can convey what is actually being done in these gender clinics.
You raise an important point. We often focus so much on the fact that these folks don't know what a woman is, that we miss the fact that they really don't know what a child is.
Yes, yeah.
All right, come on up.
Hi, my question is for Magdalena. I'm a father of a 16-year-old trans-identifying daughter, currently wearing a binder. She wants to take testosterone when she's 19, maybe do surgery. Is there anything, looking back, that your parents, relatives, other friends, or other friends of the family could have done to help you have not gone through some of the tough times?
My experience was definitely a little bit different, just because I was technically an adult when this happened. But I think if your child is still a child, just be a parent. You know, if your kid came to you and said, "Dad, I hate my nose, I want to get a nose job," you'd say, "Well, sweetie, that's nice. You're beautiful. You don't need to change yourself." So I think having the uncomfortable conversations with your children and asking where are these feelings coming from? Because oftentimes it comes out of nowhere and we don't really understand, what's going on. Or so I would just say to be really present with your child and have conversations, but don't affirm. Just don't affirm. Yeah.
Can I add something? I just want to add something to that. So I've heard from a number of detransitioners and a number of parents that Abigail Schreier's Irreversible Damage, which is on the table over here, they did a deal with their teenage daughter. They asked her to read the first chapter. Just give me that, just read the first chapter. And then on many occasions, she ended up reading the whole thing and detransitioning. So I highly recommend trying it.
If I might make one addition as well, the one thing to be concerned about in the province of British Columbia is that policy of the Ministry of Children and Family Development is failure to affirm is grounds to apprehend. So it is important that if you won't sterilize your child, the state will seize your child and sterilize them if you get their attention. And so I run a support group in Vancouver. Some of the members are parents going through exactly what you're going through, and it's a real tightrope dealing with MCFD, and there's tremendous caution that has to be exercised there. So whatever you say, try and say it before MCFD becomes aware of you, is all I would add. Yeah.
One of the things that I've come across, there was this mother who had a daughter that also wanted to transition, and she was trying to figure out what she could do. And what she ultimately did and halted her daughter going through this process was she became a parent in the household, and she told her daughter, she took away technology, number one, that was gone. No phone, no access to the internet, no access to social media, and all the influences that way. She was also a part of a social group, like she had like 5 friends that were all conveniently in the same sort of headspace, even though we're told social contagion is not a thing. And so they also technically kind of grounded her, like removed her from her friend group for that time, because it was really sensitive. And they would go on she would strategically go on long drives with her and put on podcasts or anything that was talking about the other side of this. And they wouldn't even necessarily talk about it, but she can't turn her ears off. She has to listen. And ultimately, her daughter ended up, saying, oh, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I'm not thinking this way anymore. So that, for me personally, that really resonated with me. I don't have an issue with my daughters that way, but if I did, I really feel like that approach would work really well, for me at least. So I just needed to say that.
Thanks so much. Where's our camera?
All right.
Yeah.
I have
Oh, you got the mic.
thing. It's just policy.
Policy.
Bad things have happened at previous events.
Politicians that keep on talking and won't give up the mic. That could never happen. I don't know what you're talking about.
That's why they got a politician to do it.
That's right. That's right. Camera's over here. Okay. So, Stuart mentioned the policy of the Ministry of Children, Families, and Youth. So the current minister is named Grace Laura, and she happens to be the MLA currently in the riding of Victoria, Beacon Hill, as many of you likely know. And I am the Conservative Party BC candidate in the riding of Victoria, Beacon Hill, and I plan to replace her. So the first motion that our leader, John Rustad, did in his first question and question period was to promise that we will eliminate SOGI. The first bill, private members bill that we passed was the Fairness for Women's and Girls Sports Act to protect women's sport. And we have both committed publicly to protecting women's spaces and to protecting our children from sterilization. How am I doing? I got 10 seconds left?
Awesome.
So you've got 5 weeks before an election on October the 19th, and maybe you've never been political before, but if you want a government that's going to stand up for women's sports, women's spaces, and to protect your children, come find me and get involved, okay? We can do this. You're strong. Stuart said that the hour is later than we think. Well, look at the women on this panel today. Look at everybody in this room. We are stronger than we think.
Yeah.
Let's do this.
Sorry, this is a little bit of a step back to the question before. I have 2 children, both at some point, well, they're young adults now. So they both went through a period of time when they felt they were identifying as other, or felt like, my son felt like he was gay, my daughter felt like she was lesbian. They thought, oh, great, she won't get pregnant early. But that passed. So anyway, the thing is, I kept directing them back to the identity crisis is not solved by gender. I think it's much deeper, don't we agree? It's who you are asking that question. Who am I is a spiritual question, I believe, much deeper. So, yeah, maybe having those conversations as a way to find self and maybe solve many of our problems, I believe, spiritual problems. Knowing oneness would solve so many of these divisions we're experiencing in the world. So anyway, question of who I am is deeper than identity, gender identity. That's the point. Thank you.
Can I say something? But we need to ask, who are we as a country as well? Who am I and who are we? What do we want to be? We can't, we've just gone on too long letting everybody else define, or somebody with an agenda define who we are in Canada. I mean, we need to get back to who we really, really are as Canadians, and we are caring, but we are also fact-based, and we want to be kind, fair, but also that means that we cannot be sold a bill of goods and be tricked into doing stuff that we don't believe in. Mm-hmm. That's the key, whatever party.
Right, come on up.
Just to invite parents who are struggling with feeling alone or isolated, if your kids are gender confused or distressed, I'd invite you to look up resources for yourselves, namely Gender Dysphoria Support Network, Our Duty Canada, and parents of ROGD kids. So that's it. Thanks.
Excellent organizations, very much worth your time. Anyone else from the audience? Okay. All right, our movement's answer to Terry Fox.
Okay, so part of my campaign is to cycle for independent media. And because we know that legacy media or the managed media is not doing their job. And so shout out here to Brian Edgar and Storm Rider News, because he's doing the job today. The other part of my campaign is to knock on the door of the church and have a conversation surrounding sanctity of life. Because sanctity of life does not end when that baby is born. Sanctity of life needed to be defended when this young woman needed some advocacy. So my question for the panel is, as I knock on the door of the mainstream church, what would you have me ask them?
Well, what do you mean by the mainstream church? Who is that?
So I can tell you that the ecumenical church includes Lutheran, Methodist, United, Anglican, and Catholic.
The main line.
Those are ecumenical churches. The mainstream churches are the range between Pentecostal, Baptist, Evangelical, and Alliance. And so that's how I've grouped those two together. You may think that I've got friends within the mainstream church as I share the same redemptive blood. Mm-hmm. It's not always the case. And we've had very good conversations together. I have never been escorted from the building, but I can tell you that I've upset a few people.
Well, you know, the religious aspect of gender identity ideology is almost rivaling now anything that the church, Christian or any other kind of church, the power of any church that church has had in this country, whether it's Catholicism. I mean, gender identity ideology has is in everything. I know, for example, there are evangelical churches in Abbotsford where some churches are pro-sex-based rights and others that it's like, well, Jesus would say you should be nice, and they buy into the gender ideology. So this ideology that's coming along right now, which is, to me, it's a kind of religion because it requires a religious belief. And it's actually infusing its way through churches, through bureaucracies, through everything. And what I've noticed, and here's my point, what I've noticed is, the woke will talk about equal opportunity society, equal opportunity, this, that, and that. How about equal accountability society? How about what it turns out to be is that, and I saw some protesters out there a little while ago, they feel like they don't have to account to anybody for what they do. There's a certain sector of the population that never has to account for anything they do. And this includes a lot of our bureaucrats. So whether it's clergy, the church, bureaucrats, whatever, everybody has a duty of accountability. They don't get exempt just because they're in a special group. And I think that's just my answer. Equal accountability society. That's what I'm asking for.
I will briefly supplement this just because my doctorate is in American space religions, and I want to assure you that gender wang is an American space religion. It's a type of religion, Scientology, Farrakhan's Nation of Islam, Mormon fundamentalism. American space religions share a belief that every person has a pre-existent soul that possesses race and gender before being born. That is a crucial theological tenet of American space religion. And we have been producing American space religions for 200 years. They have other similar theologies. They are godless. They believe that God is a person, a human, who figured out the rules of the universe and made himself God. So we see this is actually a specific type of religious enthusiasm and a specific type of church. It's not like a religion. It is a religion. It just shares the features of an American space religion, a godless faith based on pre-existent raced and gendered souls. And there's all kinds of terminology from the field of religious studies that we could be applying to this right now. And the last one I'll leave you with is there's a term for people who achieve a status of holiness and infallibility in these religions through engaging in acts of flamboyant self-harm. These people were called the athletes of God during the Roman Empire. And one of the most famous, the theologian Origen, he repented of this religion after cutting off his penis. So many of these things have been with us for a while. And for those who think that the religion, there's a pharmaceutical element, there's a business element, there's an authoritarian element, but they are united in a religious faith. Now, I see we're at 1:15. I'm going to ask the panel for any last words, and then I think we'll go into the individual discussions for those who have tickets to stay on. Any last words, folks?
No, not really, but thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I think that these conversations are opening up a lot. Canadians are feeling braver. And I think so much of that, as I've said many times, I think, starts with people showing up, seeing each other's faces. I think these kinds of events are so galvanizing. This is why we do them. This is why I keep pushing to put on these live and in-person events in Canada, because I think it changes everything. Every time I've done one of these events since, I think I've been speaking publicly since 2018 or something like that, there's always people who come up after or talk to me later and said, like, I met so-and-so and we started a group and we started doing something. So yeah, thank you so much for everyone who came, and thank you so much to everyone who's supporting us. We have a lot of support, a lot of volunteer support here, sound, security, moderators, our volunteers who are helping organize, and we don't have $1.5 million in funding from the government, so we really appreciate everyone who's supporting us, and thanks again.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience.